Oh, you're
Have
at the,
you? Yeah.
I love it. Okay, Justin. We're about to start, Justin. I'm gonna
Okay, I'm
mute
gonna.
you. Hi, everyone. Welcome for those of you joining us on Zoom and for those of you joining us on Facebook Live. My name is Clementine Bordeaux. I am here as a representative of Racing Magpie, and on behalf of our whole team, I want to welcome everyone for this exciting presentation that's a part of our seasonal programming called Winter Camp. And today, Lennixx Bad Moccasin will be sharing some writing practices and talking about relationality. And if you're not familiar with Racing Magpie, we're a Lakota-centric arts and culture organization founded in 2015 in Rapid City, South Dakota, so in Mini Luzaha And we center the practice of being a good relative in everything that one does. And our work is focused on elevating and amplifying the ongoing work of Oceti Sakowin artists and culture bearers within our communities. And so a part of this process is this kind of virtual model of a winter camp, thinking through community building and problem solving and examining the broader world from a cultural perspective and to think through the way that Oceti Sakowin people interact with the world. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Lennixx and they will share with us today.
Thank you. Haumidake ape chante washte nape chuyuz apiro, Lennixx imake apiro, Lakota na dama kota, wambali paha eri machache, wakba washte, eromawapi, Minnesota wunspe wanktuya ed wabadawa. I think I got it all. Okay, hello everybody. I'm Lennixx Granados Bad Moccasin. I'm Dakota and Lakota of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe. I grew up in Eagle Butte, South Dakota, and I'm an enrolled member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe. And I currently study at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities. I currently reside in Minneapolis, and I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in the Department of American Studies. And I specifically do work related to Indigenous storytelling. It sort of has evolved kind of storytelling within urban spaces and within literary or written words. It's a very specific type of storytelling. So yeah, that's me. Thanks for having me today. And I kind of wanted to take today to sort of talk about writing as a form of relationality and as a form of cultural reconciliation, particularly within the written word, as that's the medium that I am most experienced in. And sort of just to like give people an idea of like where I'm operating from as a scholar and as a Lakota Dakota person, I'm just going to quickly sort of read off the abstract of my dissertation proposal. It's changed in some ways since it's been written, and I'm sure it'll change more. But this kind of gives a very general idea of what I'm working in. So it goes, in what ways do Indigenous storytellers articulate their existences through the worlds they create, and how does that articulation aid in survival during times of crisis? Storytelling is a cornerstone for an immeasurable number of Indigenous cultures across the globe. Much like language, it's a space of solace for culture where it lives, thrives, and survives. In essence, story is history. And while I don't aim to have my work be heavily historical, it's crucial that I posit story as a vessel of culture and time. It's equally crucial to emphasize that story is the lifeblood of cultural survival. It has helped carve paths towards the revitalization of language and the preservation of ceremonial practices. I do not intend to interrogate how story has played out as a nexus throughout time, but rather give context how story has a firm place in the history of indigeneity and Indigenous survival, and as such is uniquely equipped to complicate notions of time, space, and place, while operating as a mechanism of survival. Ultimately, I argue that storytellers create new modes of healing that enable them to better survive and exist as good ancestors and caretakers of community. So now, what does this all mean? An excellent question that I am sort of thinking about all the time. I have this very specific past with storytelling, with writing. I come from a family of readers and people who have had some form of artistic expression. And mine what is just is writing. I can't do art stuff. I can't do visual art. I'm just not good. But I am somewhat of a writer, and that has a basis in that reading history, as well as sort of how I came to understand myself as a person within my family, and within my community. I talk a bit about how story is a very broad term, and I sort of link it in many ways to memory, because my mom, her parents, my grandma and grandpa, they passed away within the year before I was born. My grandma in the fall, and then my grandpa the following spring, when my mom was pregnant with me. So I was never able to meet them. And everything I've sort of learned about them and sort of their parenting and my mom's own upbringing has been through my mom's memories, through this sort of oral storytelling that is very prominent amongst Native people. And there's a sort of uh, form of care, I feel, in storytelling and how we carry our culture more broadly, our languages, our ceremonies, but also how we carry our families and our relatives and how we pass that on. And I think a lot about what it means to be a good relative and how that is something that is so broad and you hear about it a lot, but it's hard to sort of pin down how one becomes a good relative. And because I come from this family that, you know, has this artistic expression and has this relationship with the written word, um, I sort of I choose to do that through my writing in a way. And what I mean by this is I I look at being a good relative as the same as being a good ancestor. It's not just how we are taking care of those we are in community with now. It's how we are building structures that will take care of those who are after us, who the younger people in our families and our children and future grandchildren. And there's this notion. I'm going to read something again very quickly. I am currently the recipient of something called the Ford Predoctoral Fellowship. And in my application, I had to talk about previous research and how that sort of influenced my thinking going forward with research and with storytelling and with writing. And I talk about one of the projects I've worked on in the past that is about place names, language, writing, storytelling. And I write at the very end, such a project requires making ties to the people of the land, those who know its medicines and speak its languages. It requires finding kinship with others who realize that relationality doesn't mean remembering the past to understand the present. It means knowing that the past, the present, and the future happen all at once. That the urgency of yesterday is still the urgency of today. That being a good ancestor doesn't start years down the line, it starts now. So how does this all come together? Another great question that I've been thinking about a lot. And I feel like I have this very specific role, duty as a relative that's strange to articulate because I am someone who has no children and someone who may never have children. But of course, that doesn't like exempt you from being a good relative, a good ancestor. I still have nieces and nephews, and their children will be my grandchildren. I'll be a grandpa in that sense. And even if I'm not a parent, I will still be an ancestor one day. Like that is just a given. So how do we ensure that we are a good ancestor? And how do we contribute to these structures that we create and that we hope to have carried on? How do we contribute to healing? How do we contribute to breaking cycles in a way that's meaningful and will continue through generations beyond us? And I do that through writing, which again is a little strange to think about because it sounds odd for a number of reasons. But kind of going back to myself, I live far away, not far away, but far for me, okay? I live out of state from where I grew up, and I'm sort of the only one of like my mom's children who does live far away and who isn't in some sort of community that is close to family. And it's a very difficult journey. It's a very specific journey. And how do you be a good relative when, at least when it comes to those community and blood ties, you are not around relatives? That is an obstacle that I think many urban natives are trying to like figure out, especially those who come from smaller communities away from those urban spaces. And I have come to sort of this idea of I don't want to call it self-care, but I do think that you need to be able to take care of yourself in order to properly take care of others. Like you need to lay that foundation within yourself. And there are many ways to do that and to sort of seek um, others who will help you do that. You in essence have to sort of build a community away from your community to maintain who you are as a relative and to continue to contribute to those relatives from afar. You know, you might just visit them, you might just be um, someone they hear from every so often for a certain period of time or a long period of time. And what do you do within that framework? And I, ooh, I talk a lot about um, the written word because that's sort of become my mechanism of survival. I've mentioned in my statements that part of taking care of yourself is making sure that you are surviving and to making sure that you are getting through whatever context you are living in so that you can be a good relative. You can't be a good relative if you are not there, if you are not surviving, if you are not nourishing your spirit in some way. And I look at writing as a way to do that because it allows for your own self and your own recollection of other people to live on in some form. And I think what's been interesting about writing specifically is we're not typically, I'm just speaking as like a Lakota Dakota individual, but oral storytelling is a huge thing and written language isn't really a thing that was before. And there's lots of sort of attempts to reconcile sort of like the violent ways that history has been recorded and history has been erased, and a hesitancy to sort of fight that with like the written word, which in itself has been a part of that erasure against Native people. So how does someone do that? How does someone be a writer? How does someone write with the written word and use their language in a way that makes sense to them? Because I've met many people, many colleagues, many community members who really just don't like writing in Dakota or Lakota. They just don't like it, and I understand why. And there's a lot of um I think very valuable viewpoints that are against sort of things like orthography within language learning and sort of learning how to document a language that isn't necessarily something that's been documented by our ancestors in that way. And it's very difficult to feel like you're honoring those ancestors when you're not maybe learning it the way you feel they think you should learn it. And that's something that I really don't have an answer on. I know my own reconciliations with language and how I learn it and how I use it, but that's really just for myself. And I think a big part of being a writer and of being someone who's a language learner is finding a way to reconcile that within themselves as well. And it's not going to make everybody happy. Everyone's not going to agree on what you choose to do. But ultimately, it is sort of your responsibility to find a way to continue learning, even if that means hearing certain dissenting voices on how you choose to do so. It's a very sensitive terrain, and I understand that. And um, all I can hope as someone who is familiar with that is to be someone who can be encouraging to others. Um, but to sort of get back to writing a bit, I kind of wanted to talk about a few of my past stories that I've written, um, and how they've been helpful, for lack of a better word. Um, I wrote a story for for imagining indigenous futurisms. I think it was 2020, possibly 2021. I can't remember right now. I was gonna look into that, but I forgot. But I wrote for that, and I was selected as the recipient for that year for the story called The Box. And it's a science fiction story, and it's really strange. Because everything I write is strange. But it's essentially a story of how do we honor our elders and our relatives during a very specific crisis. Within the story, there's a pandemic happening, and I didn't set out to like write a pandemic story. It was more like I felt such a frustration and a sense of helplessness during that time of trying to care for my own relatives and the people that I love in my life who are very vulnerable during that time, and sort of trying to fight this feeling of resentment, this feeling of bitterness towards a community that didn't necessarily share the same viewpoint as I did in trying to honor that safety of those people. And it was a very difficult time, and I just sort of wrote this story without thinking too much about it. And within the story, what essentially happens is like the characters are in a semi-futuristic setting, and they find a way to put the consciousness of their grandparent into an android, and allow him to sort of live on for a while longer. And there's also like a whole story behind that, but it was essentially this idea that I was fighting at the time, this idea that people who were older and who were vulnerable during this time, well, they'd lived long enough. You know, that's what people would say. So it's okay if they are in danger. It's okay if they pass away. That's a lot of the vibe I was getting. And also others who had health problems. You know, if you're vulnerable, then that's your fault. It's a very white supremacist eugenics way of looking at things that I really didn't like seeing permeated within these communities that I grew up in and really cared about. But I was kind of basically asserting this idea that these people, specifically these elders, even if they've lived this long life, even if they've lived longer than maybe other relatives we've had, they've earned that. Like they have earned this time, even if it's just a couple more years, you know, they have earned that time and they deserve that time. And a character within the story, originally, thing was this idea was developed by his grandparent because he was learning Dakota from him. And his grandparent, his grandfather wanted him to keep learning this language. So he had his granddaughter put his mind after he died into a box. That's why it's called the box. It's a small box, so that they could speak to each other through this box. Um, and the character himself realized, like, you, this elder, this person I love, you are more than just what you can give me. You are more than just someone I can learn language from. You are a person. You are a relative who deserves to live the life they've earned. And so it goes from a voice in a box to like designing this android that he can be a person in for a little while longer, at least the amount of time he would have lived had he not passed away from this specific pandemic. And it was really just about wanting to, one, give personhood to these vulnerable groups, and also try to understand where my frustration was coming from and why I was so angry. Like, I didn't know why I was angry. I mean, I knew why, but I didn't necessarily know what was working in here, what was causing this feeling of resentment, this nihilistic sort of um person that I just don't feel I am. So in writing this story and being able to share it with other people, it just helped me understand that. And it helped me move on from that, and sort of help me conceptualize or articulate what I was trying to say, what I was trying to tell people about this particular moment in time. And I think it was useful because it was accessible. It was a genre story, and people were able to see it as um, something that they might otherwise put into a box that they think is not for them. That they think, oh, this is like a native story or an Indian story, and everyone's like, that has to be a certain thing, which I disagree. Native stories can just be anything, really. That's kind of my stance on that. Um, so there was that story. And then fast forward a year, I wrote another one that was essentially a vampire story, but it was really about isolation, the importance of community, the importance of asking for help. And that was during a time when I needed to do those things. I was kind of very isolated, partially because of the pandemic and how everything was still shut down at that time. And I was getting lost in that, and then sort of telling this character what to do, or helping them work through it. I sort of was working through it as well. Um, so it helped me move past that. And I'm not saying I'm the greatest relative ever or anything like that, but I feel I am a better relative when I am able to articulate these things that I am working through during a certain point in time. And that helps me sort of look at how I am in relation to others and how I need to perhaps make adjustments, how I need to um, think about how I'm in relation with myself, and how that can be very pivotal. I'm saying that right, pivotal to sort of being a relative to a larger community. Um, and the last thing I want to speak about before I'll open it up to any questions, is the play I've been adapting recently to a screenplay, which I've done for um, the Sinew Fund. That's sort of the basis of the application for the Sinew Fund. Is a while back, many moons ago, I forget, I was in college. I kind of made a joke about something to do with myself. When I was a child, my family would call me Baby Treat because my middle name is Treat. So my siblings would call me Baby Treat. And I was sort of a vicious child. I was sort of a problem child. And I saw Baby Treat as this very, I don't know, tyrannical entity. And I sort of saw that part of myself, that younger part of myself, as the thing that tries to take over when I'm going through like a difficult time. And it was sort of a joke. I think it was a Facebook post. Like it was just a throwaway thing. And then I wrote a short story and kind of used that concept of a part of yourself suppressing other traits that you have during times of crisis, because um, there's a familiarity I feel when you go through times of crisis of that panic and that pain that parts of us just know. Like when it happens, we're like, oh yes, the trauma again. You know, it kind of comes up and you're like, hello, my old friend. So that sort of became the basis of a short story that I made into a 10-minute play that was produced by the New Native Theater here in Minneapolis for their 10-minute play festival. I believe it was 2018 when that happened. And then I entered another competition. I've never written a proper play, but I expanded on this one for this specific submission and made it a longer play and sort of added to it. And it's a very strange play. It's about basically parts of a person's mind get trapped within a space and they're all starting to disappear and they're trying to figure out why they're disappearing and sort of what's happening in the real world that's leading them to be in conflict with themselves. And that was produced through USC, University of Southern California, I believe. And that particular play is now the basis of the screenplay that I am adapting and will be read in front of my home community. So we'll see how that goes. And then from then on, it will also be the basis of sort of a small study on mental health, kind of dealing with some of the questions I had about how writing can help with relationality, can help with internal reconciliation. And hopefully that can then go on to be the basis of a production. There's many stages to that, but that's essentially what I'm currently working on. And part of the Sinew Fund is helping me work on that. So now I will open it up to questions, or if Clementine had any
Yeah,
follow-up.
thank you, Lennixx. We actually have a question already. Ray asked, what sparked your initial interest in playwriting and screenwriting?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. I honestly, it had to do with the fact that I really liked watching, like many a res kid, movies and TV with family growing up. And I was always fascinated by that process, that creative process, the collaboration in that. And then as I sort of got older, um, and I would typically just write for myself or write in a way that a novelist would write. I kind of realized there was something really exciting about being able to write something and have someone else like say it and bring it to life and have a director interpret that, and seeing something that you created being seen through other eyes, seeing different iterations of that, and sort of the community building, the teamwork that takes, and sort of the vulnerability that everybody has to bring to that. It's always been very, um, I don't know, it's been very new, because writing as a novelist would is very isolating. And so writing in this way, when you're thinking about that, and if you're involved in the production of that, it's very different. It kind of commands that you um, interact with others and create good relations with others. So I think I really enjoy that component, and that's sort of what allowed that interest to thrive over the years.
Cool. Thank you. Ray says thank you as well. I have, it's kind of a two-part question. One, like what were the things that you were reading and watching? Because you seem to kind of lean into the sci-fi fantasy, which I also really appreciate. I'm always like, why can't we be weird? But it's also like culturally relevant, right? Like we had all those things in our stories anyway. So one part, like what were you reading, watching when you were growing up that inspired you? And then also maybe what Ocheti Shakoin stories like also inspire you.
Yeah, I watched, okay, listen. I watched a lot of, okay, ever since I was very little, I watched a lot of horror related stuff and as well as sci-fi, fantasy, supernatural adjacent. Um, my family's just a very big horror movie, especially type of family. We're fans of that. And so it's my interest in storytelling have always leaned towards sort of genre fare as a result of that. I also watched like Buffy the Vampire Slayer when it was first on, and Angel and Charmed, and that sort of thing that typically my mom or sisters would pick, and they had very good taste because those are very good shows. And as a result, something I really appreciate about that is I was watching a show recently that's currently airing on AMC called Dark Winds. And there's lots of indigenous creatives and actors involved in that show. And there's a supernatural element to it. But whenever I talk about it with someone else, I'm like, well, it's supernatural, but I see those things as part of the natural world within our cultural beliefs. And something that I appreciate about genre stuff is sort of that stuff, these tales of creatures or of supernatural or of magics or medicines. These are things that don't feel outside of the realm of possibility. Like and as a result, I don't, there are some people who might look down on it, but I'm like, no, this is where the real stuff is at, like that's sort of that idea. So there was that. And as for like Ocheti Shokongi stories, there's a lot about Iktomi that I really found interesting because there's this just because the idea of a trickster not being bad, not being good, um, having lessons that maybe we don't fully understand to impart, and that sort of grayness of morality. That's something that I really appreciated. I also think it's nice how whenever you're a kid and grown-ups or your older siblings are scaring you about chichis and all this sort of thing, it's sort of um it kind of gives your childhood um like your childhood feels very like you had a childhood. Like there's a lot to it. Like it feels full in a way when you get to have that sort of cross between cultural story, teasing, family dynamics. Like that's something I've always really, really appreciated. And as um, when I moved to the city, went to college, etc., and met indigenous people from other nations, other tribes, I just really like learning from them as well. And sort of my favorite thing, maybe it's problematic that I like to do is say, so what's your creation story? Like how'd you get here? Like what's going on there? So yeah, that's sort of, it all kind of blends together for me because of that upbringing and those specific type of stories I consumed as a child.
Yeah, I actually really appreciate that you ask what are your creation stories, because I think that also then gives you an idea of how they're viewing the world, right? Like, I think about our Iya story and like we come from a rock, right? Like a rock gave of itself so that we could have life, and so we hold dear those things. And I have other friends heard their creation stories, like they danced their way into creation, right? And that has such a different kind of formation of how we're viewing the world. um but could you talk a little bit more about your vampire story? I just finished binging Angel for the first time. I was late to the game, but I just finished binging Angel. But I would love to hear a little bit more about your vampire story and how that one came to be.
Yeah, for sure. So I did that thing where like within the vampire story, it's never called a vampire. And it was very specifically about someone, well, the story was called Flea Bites, and it was about an individual who gets bitten by a few fleas on his ankle. Because that happens. Fleas bite you, and those bites don't heal for a long time. So like essentially that happened, and he didn't realize that those fleas had sort of been on this vampire who had died. And as a result, that vampirism was being transferred to him. And the way vampirism worked within the story was um, if you didn't like feed, you would slowly forget who you were and you would slowly become monstrous looking. And the whole thing with that I sort of make a point of as a throwaway line is this character, his culture probably has a ceremony, maybe not intended for this, but like a ceremony that would clear that up for him. Like he'll go into one sweat and he'll be fine. But because he's someone who isolates himself and who's so full of shame and won't reach out when something like this is happening because he doesn't know what it is because of that shame, it kind of exasperates the problem. And he's also a character who sort of comes from a legacy of violence. He has relatives, including like his own father, his brother, his cousins who are violent men. And in order for him to sort of thrive as this vampire creature, which he doesn't know that's what it is, but he's sort of learning that in order to thrive as this vampire creature, he has to be violent, and he doesn't want to do that. But he also doesn't want people to know that he's worried about being a violent person like these other people. So his isolation just kind of piles on top of itself, and he has sort of like this choice of like, okay, you can do what this vampire before him did, which was isolate himself to protect people, because he feels his isolation is helping other people. Like if I'm staying away, they're good. If I'm not seeking help, it's better for them. So I'm going to sort of isolate until I forget who I am, which is what the vampirism does to him. And at the end, he's faced with a choice where he can either find help for that or try to start finding help by speaking to his friends, his family about it, or he can isolate himself and sort of start the process over again. That's been happening. So that's sort of where that specific story ended up being. It's a bit of a bummer story, but like I wrote it on Halloween, sort of last minute, and I was like, I'm just gonna write stuff, which is kind of how I write things. So it was a very interesting experience because I didn't even realize that there were certain things that I was also avoiding at the time. So it was very cathartic, you could say, which I think a lot of artistic individuals would say that their work helps them in a similar fashion. So yeah, that's what that one was about.
Awesome. Thank you so much for expanding on that vampire story. I appreciate all the different vampire genres that have come out, right? Like What We Do in the Shadows and like energy vampires and all these different ways that vampirism is like explored and talked about, and the way that they also then start to represent these different metaphors in our lives. Um, Justin has a question, said, great presentation, conversation, and where do you see yourself in 5 years or after the PhD? I know that's it. Come on, Justin, we're when you're in the midst of grad school, that's such a heavy question. But yeah, where do you hope to see your work go? What hopes do you have as you progress through your PhD and move on beyond that?
It's okay, Justin. It's okay. Thanks for the question. It's a good thought exercise. I appreciate it. I would say in 5 years after sort of like I'm sure this PhD will be done within 5 years. It better be. But with that in mind, I would probably honestly, I would really enjoy I really just want to listen. I was sort of speaking with my friend and colleague who's in the same program as me about this, I was like, I just really wanna like write and get paid for it. And whatever that looks like, I will be content. I just want to be able to do this thing I really enjoy in whatever form it may present itself. And also in some way help my family either be present. Like I can be a writer in South Dakota and like be there for my family as they are getting older or growing up, depending on which family members I'm thinking of. Um, but if I were to be like the head in the clouds, like real starving artist thing, I really want to go to California and try to be a television writer. That's sort of always been something I've been interested in, at least since I was a teenager. And that's a very strange path because it's not like there's not a career path to that. Like there's so many different ways you can get there. Um, so because of that, I've kind of always kept that as a possibility because you can try to get there at any point wherever you are. Um, but otherwise, yes, I want to be writing and I want to be there for my family. Like the kind of broad ideas, but those are the things I kind of see in my future, regardless. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I would love like a native horror. I know we have that anthology that just came out, Never Whistle at Night, right? Like I would love to see some of those stories like come to the screen. I've always wanted more horror stories. Because I think we have such cool stories too, where it is just like you said, that kind of moral ambiguity and figuring out like the lessons that we're learning from bad choices, or even lessons that we learn from good choices when it might not make us feel good when we're making the right choice, right?
Yeah.
So, and yeah, and I also, yeah, Justin says, thanks. We asked because we want to help you achieve those dreams. And I agree, like part of the reason, I mean, I'm excited that you're one of the Sinew Fund recipients, but also I tend, when I ask folks to participate in winter camp, I tend to ask like younger generational folks because I want our community to see that we have, young writers and people that are trying to carry our cultural ways of knowing into like these new genres and new ways of telling stories. And so it's really exciting just to hear all your different stories that you have been writing and sharing. And also thinking on a theoretical level, right? In the PhD process, I know it's a lot of connecting all these dots between how we're telling stories and also like theoretically, like what we're working through.
Yes.
So if folks have more questions, you can also unmute yourself if you're in the Zoom chat, or if you're on Facebook Live, please just drop a comment on our post. And yeah, is there any other questions from the Zoom room? I feel like I have to be that good teacher where you're like sitting and waiting, for some,
Yeah.
like I can be okay with comfortable with silence. But so I also maybe
Can you guys hear me?
Oh, yes. Caitlin?
Yes.
Okay, yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm sitting in my car in the parking lot, so I hope you appreciate this, Lennixx, that I came to support you. I was okay. First question, am I a character in one of your stories? No, just that's joking. No, so I was really interested in you talking about fear and kind of like your interest in horror stories. And so I was wondering if you kind of were like thinking about like, I guess a way fear operates maybe differently, the same as maybe like fear in settler contexts or in settler movies, if maybe there's more productivity and fear. Like I missed some of what you were talking about, but I think you were talking about relationships and isolation. And so any kind of ideas about way you're maybe thinking about fear differently or similarly to like settler contexts or settler films?
Thank you, Kaylin, for the question. It was a very good question. You always ask very good questions. Thanks for coming to support. Um, And I do have this draft of this like grad school cohort who are in the middle of like a I know what you did last summer horror movie scenario. So maybe is the answer to that little question. But I feel like as for fear, I think fear is a very I might be going off from your question, but I think fear is a very powerful storytelling device. And in the workshop that I co-chair for, that you've co-chaired for as well, Kaylin, I did have a prompt where I asked people, would you rather experience fear or cause fear, and why? And it was kind of out of pocket on my behalf, but I think it was a very interesting like idea to sort of gauge what fear does and sort of what fear operates as, and how oftentimes I've noticed there's like this sense of fear in certain horror movies of like natives, of like the wild natives, of the savage natives, of natives messing with how people understand Western society, because like our ways don't always usually don't jive with that, and how a sort of a resurgence or whatever you want to call it of a native way of understanding is sort of threatening to colonial systems at large, and how sometimes I'm like, well, good. I hope you I hope you feel scared. So that's sort of the way I see it. And I look at how um on another side of that is the fact that like going through life is really scary. And sort of going through these worlds that we're not used to for whatever reason. In my case, and in many cases for people who are like me, it's like I'm just a res kid, y'all. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know. I didn't know how to go to college or grad school or live in a city. Everything is a little scary. So sort of having to live in this world as a native person, you just have to confront fear every day, which is exhausting, but also, I don't know, it's kind of badass. I don't know if I can, I don't know if I can say that. It's kind of like cool, especially when you're in community with those who are on similar paths. And I think that can be very powerful when you're talking about community, when you're talking about collaboration, those sort of shared experiences around fear. Um, so yeah, that'd be my tangential answer to the question.
Cool. Thank you, Kaylin. Oh,
Thank
you were unmuting.
Oh, I was just saying thanks. And I was at that workshop when you asked that question. So,
Yes, you were.
and I said I'd rather be scared than scare people. So,
You're
Yeah.
valid.
Yeah. No, I think, right. It is a balance. I think, we don't want to be scary. That's not how we've operated in our life culturally, right? Like our goal is to be a good relative. And I really appreciated, Lennixx, what you said earlier about like, yeah, I may not have children, but I'm still going to be an ancestor, right? We're still going to like be responsible and accountable and reciprocal to those relatives that we have that are younger than us and older than us. And but right, I think we are placed in this position of being scary. And I didn't understand it as a kid either, right? Like transitioning from going from reservation life to now living in a city complex in a border city, right? My sister Mary calls Rapid City the suburbs of Pine Ridge, right? Because that's still within the 1868 treaty lands, and they're in our homelands, but right where our like physical presence is like scary to people. Even though we're not, I'm like, I feel the most safe when I'm around res folks.
Yeah.
I'm actually more scared of settlers than they probably are of me. So I appreciate, yeah, Kaylin, I also appreciate that question of like how do we balance and understand fear? Because I also think too, like I'm operating from a place of fear of failing, of like letting people down. So I'm also like, what are all the things I can pile on my plate to ensure that I'm in service to community, which is not also like healthy for us, right? We need balance and rest and all the other things. So maybe in closing, if we don't have, do we have any more questions from the Zoom room? Oh, that was my computer. Apologies. Okay, if we don't have any more questions from the Zoom room, I think in a closing, kind of if you can share with us maybe what are what are things that you do to find rest, right? I think you talked a little bit about self-care in the beginning, and not necessarily, I think self-care for Native people looks very different. Sometimes our self-care is like going and being in service of other people, but like, what are some things you do for self-care and rest? And then what are the stories that have brought you joy? And that could be your closing kind of contribution.
Yeah, so at self-care and rest, this is another great question that I'm always grappling with. I feel like this is like the lamest little answer to this part, but I started reading again, like reading things I want to read, just just to read them, like not for any other reason, like just to read them. I've been reading like memoirs of non-Indigenous people, just like whatever. And I realized that, and sort of hearing other people's stories, it helps me feel like that fullness. And I think that's very important. And I also really like, again, not much. I don't I live a very a very quiet, very sober, very tired early type of life already. I'm already an elder. But I will say I really enjoy just being around other people and sort of, especially friends who have families. I just like being around that liveliness. And I also really like um, helping my colleagues do whatever they're trying to do. Like just sort of like being there, being present, engaging in a way that's like not on my phone, because that does not bring me peace, but like being able to engage with others, that's very, I don't know, it's been very good for me, I think. And that's kind of been a recent focus, I'd say. And as for, oh, and also like, I like going to native things. Like I'm a really quiet person, but if there's like a native thing, I'll stand there and and I'll listen and nod my head and laugh. I'll be a part of the ambiance of the room. I think that's where I'm most comfortable. And as for stories, that's there's a lot of sort of listen, I talk a lot about the concept of a multiverse in my work just because, there's it's sort of like, I mean, a multiverse can be hard to conceptualize, but it's actually it helps sort of illustrate how layered everything is, how complicated everything is. And so I really enjoyed like this movie called Everything Everywhere All at Once when it came out. Um, and it was just, I don't know, I liked it because it was like this big, ridiculous, expansive story, but it was really a story about this young person trying to find some sense of purpose and hope, and how their mother in this case like helps them sort of do that, helps them understand that, that relationality is still very close and personal within this expansive story. And also, I just really like, listen, I know Disney is what it is, but I really like superhero stuff, and I really like whenever like a creator can tell a specific story, like Echo on, which has been a Marvel thing that came out a few months ago that was about a native superhero slash anti-hero. And I just think things like that are ripe for discussion, and sort of all these things around it, but also that collaboration and that intentionality behind that creative process for these representations of Native people, in shows like Reservation Dogs and all these other things. And I don't know. That's really sort of the whole thing, the end product, but also the creation, the energy and the care that goes into creating it is something that really is really nice to learn about, and I really like experiencing and seeing and learning about. So yeah, that's my answer.
No, that was great, Lennixx. I also Everything Everywhere All at Once is one of my favorite movies. And I think one thing that I appreciate is that like we could be messy and not have all the right answers, but like the way that we continuously try to connect, right, is so important. Every time I watch the movie, I feel like I cry in a new spot. I'm just like, oh, it's just so beautiful. And I think like Michelle Yeoh and Stephanie Hsu did such an amazing job and carrying that burden, right, of like how hard it is just to try to like be in relation with people, because it's not easy, right? Like that is a challenge. And I really too, I look forward to reading your work, and I'm hoping to see it on screen soon. I know we're gonna be participating in some community readings, but also I was thinking about your kind of what you did last summer for grad students, and I was like, what? I know what you did last summer. I did not read. That's what we did last summer. Carrying around a pile of books that we never get to, but our folder full of articles that we never get to. But I wish you the best of luck in this PhD journey. I know can be very overwhelming, and I'm glad that you are finding joy in memoirs and going to Native events and connecting with folks. So I look forward to seeing more of your work, and thank you everyone who joined us on Facebook Live and joined us here in the Zoom room. So awesome.
Thank you for having me. It's awesome talking to you.
Bye.